Joining us now with more, we've got Kayvon Afshari. He's the communications director at the American-Iranian Council. Robert Caruso, a former consultant for the State Department and the Department of Defense. Lacey Healy, a partner at the Truman National Security Project and a fellow at the Stimson Center. And Akbar Ahmed, HuffPost foreign affairs reporter. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. And Akbar, perhaps you could give us the latest update here, because we just found out about an hour or two ago that the midnight deadline tonight will not be reached. They have until Thursday, and yet they're not calling it setting a new deadline. How's that?
So what they've done, Alona, is they've extended the Joint Plan of Action, the temporary agreement, which was meant to expire until July 10th. So they've bought themselves some more time. The reason this matters is not so much what's happening in Vienna as what happens here in Washington. The administration made a deal with Congress saying Congress would have 30 days to review the Iran deal were it to be reached. However, if it's reached after July 9th, which it now looks likely to be, Congress actually got 60 days. So right now it seems that Congress is going to have that additional time. The way it's being understood here is either there are still too many difficult issues that the negotiators are dealing with, but it could also actually be a smart move by the Obama administration, a way to say to Iran, we're not going to let you leverage these last few days just because we have an agreement with Congress. We're not going to let you use that deadline to force us to make concessions.
Got it. And we will certainly discuss the U.S. Congress and their role in all of this a little bit more later. But Lacey, overall, how do you think that we should look at everything that's happened in the last week? I mean, it's the culmination of years of negotiations. And should we even be setting deadlines, timelines like this? Or does that put the importance and significance of a deal like this into jeopardy?
Yeah, so first of all, this is a very, very significant deal. These things don't happen overnight, of course. This is a pretty normal negotiation to see things extend. In fact, we've seen even in the last round of negotiations, things go beyond the deadline. So this is not unusual at all. Ultimately, actually, this puts the U.S. in a slightly better negotiating position, because the U.S. Congress, in setting this deadline and requiring, coming down to either a 30-day or a 60-day window, when the U.S. said, well, we're trying to get to this point where Congress doesn't have the 60-day window, it puts them in a weaker position. And the Iranians say, well, the U.S., they want to get to a deal, they want to get to a conclusion faster than we do. And so ultimately, the U.S. really had to throw this out the window and say, you know what, we don't care. We don't care how long it takes. We want the best deal. We'll stay here until we get it. And ultimately, that's what they're doing now. They're waiting to get that best deal.
Now, earlier this week, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was asked if he was ready to leave the talks with nothing. And this is what he had to say.
If we don't have a deal, if there's absolute intransigence, if there's an unwillingness to move on the things that are important, President Obama has always said we'll be prepared to walk away. It's not what anybody wants. We want to get an agreement. But I've said from the moment I became involved in this, we want a good agreement, only a good agreement.
Robert, what do you think that it would take for the United States to walk away? Or should we even read into that statement as a serious one, or a real threat on the part of the U.S. government?
I wouldn't read too much into it. I mean, obviously, the administration is very invested in the deal. They have their own reasons for that, politically and ideologically, and I respect both of those positions and their emphasis on both of those things. However, look, Iran is not necessarily negotiating in good faith, and even though there is a good reason for us to pursue diplomatic overtures, that does not mean that all facets of Iranian society, particularly their military deep states, plural, are going to go along with the deal. There are multiple deep states. America doesn't have one. Iran has more than 3. And they're not necessarily going to bend over and do what we asked them to do just because we brought them to the negotiating table. And while the diplomats that they have dispatched to Vienna are probably operating in semi to possibly good faith, the military and the intelligence apparatuses, plural, are not going to be on the same wavelength. And that is my chief concern, followed by less than helpful rhetoric here at home, to include not holding them to account for continued support of international terrorism and attacking hundreds, if not thousands, of my comrades in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa.
Well, to your last point there, too, this is something that has become a big issue of contention. Is what's being reported is that secretly both Iran and Russia are pushing for a lifting of the arms embargo that's been placed on Iran. There's concern, of course, that the support that is already there, funding conflict abroad, funding the Islamic State, could only increase if something like that were done, if Iran were allowed to import and export weapons again. Lacey, what do you make of that being thrown in now and being something that supposedly should be on the table?
Yeah, I think we're getting down to the nitty-gritty of the agreement right now. We're seeing some other interests come in. Of course, Russia's interests, China's interests in seeing this arms embargo lifted. But ultimately, the U.S. has said that this is not something that they're willing to consider as part of a nuclear deal. Even Iran hasn't taken a very hard line on this particular issue. They've said that this shouldn't be part of any nuclear agreement, but ultimately they haven't come out and said that they won't be signing an agreement that doesn't include a lifting of the arms embargo. It's looking now more like there will be some sort of an agreement to continue considering this in the future. So this will be a U.S. and Russia issue rather than a U.S. and Iran issue, and one that we won't see as part of a nuclear negotiation. This is a nuclear negotiation. That's why we're not dealing with terrorism sanctions. That's why we're not dealing with human rights sanctions. This deal is meant to stop Iran from building a nuclear weapon. Period. That's the most important thing on the table right now.
Kayvon, what do you say to Robert's point that even if this deal was reached, that not all facets of Iranian society would actually go along with it?
Yeah, well, I think we have to be certain to frame this in an intellectually honest way and admit that Iran has made significant concessions from the outset of these negotiations, many of which are outside the framework of the NPT, of the additional protocols. So we have to understand that Iran, we have to...
significant concession. I'll give
sorry?
them that. I said they've killed less gay people this year. That's a significant concession. I'll give you that.
Right. It seems a bit like a bit of a non sequitur to me. I mean, we can certainly talk about the human rights situation in Iran, which is abysmal. It's an awful one. But if we're dealing with the nuclear issue, we should focus on the nuclear issue per se. And Iran, as a non-weapon signatory to the NPT, has the right to peacefully produce nuclear power. The concessions that they made in terms of limiting their stockpile, limiting the amount and type of centrifuges, are outside the scope of the NPT. So they've also made significant concessions here. I take that as a sign of good faith. And we have to understand that the reason that this round of negotiations is successful is not because of the pressure from sanctions. It's because of basically two things. First, Ahmadinejad is now out of office. So the U.S., just from a kind of optical perspective, can negotiate with Iran. But more importantly, the U.S. shifted away from years of a policy of zero enrichment to now a policy of limited enrichment. And that's why we're now seeing some progress on this. And, the extension here of a couple days, I think is fine. I think these are very technical issues, and it's more important that they achieve clarity on them during the negotiation phase rather than in the implementation phase when they may walk away with totally different interpretations.
Robert, would you deny that everything that Kayvon just mentioned are concessions that Iran has made, or at least steps towards working towards some kind of an agreement?
I don't agree that they've given any significant concessions other than that they have killed less gays and women this calendar year. In addition to that, I suppose if anyone's made concessions, it's America at this point, which is extremely disconcerting.
You are
did go
by
to his
talking
point.
about this
He is absolutely correct. We have made concessions. America has made horrible concessions.
Like what?
To the extent that we went from zero enrichment to partial enrichment.
That's why these are successful. That's why this round is successful.
Ever move on, but
that's why this round of negotiations is proving to be more successful than previous rounds. If you look at the previous round of negotiations with the EU from 2003 to 2005. You don't need
to convince me. Iran is never going to be my ally, and you're never going to convince me. And I also
I'm not trying to convince you of that. I'm not at all trying to convince you of that.
But this is
I'm
the way
trying to
that
take an intellectually honest, very complex issue.
You're welcome to call me intellectually dishonest. I'm just not an older white male, so this trope isn't going to work on me.
Okay, Robert, I mean, we don't need to make this about personal attacks here. The point is that in any kind of negotiation that goes on, right, there are concessions, compromises that are made by either side. And that's why something like this is taking years to actually create. And so that kind of, it makes me question too, everything that we've been working for, that all these countries have been working for the last 3 years now, coming to this deadline, is trying to basically pause Iran's nuclear program for the next 10 years. But Akbar, what happens after 10 years? Does it just start all over? 5 years from now, does a new round of negotiations have to be started?
That's a question that a lot of people are raising for the Obama administration. I think the hope in the White House is a couple of things. One is that it's better to have a window of time, whether you have 10 years or you have 15 years, which is also on the table. Have a window of time in which you can verify and subject Iran to what the White House describes as the most intrusive regime of inspections ever around the world, right? And the question is, where does Iran stand in 15 years? The hope is certainly that an Iran in which the nuclear issue is off the table, an Iran in which an opening to the West has been accomplished, is a different Iran from the Iran we see today. It's not an Iran that would build a nuclear weapon with the express purpose of harming Israel or Western interests. There's no certainty that we'll accomplish that, Alana, but that certainly is the hope, right, is that we can change Iran's behavior and perhaps build better ties between Iran and the rest of the world so you don't have the risk of an all-out conflict come 10 or 15 years from now.
I want to bring up, too, even if a deal is reached here, it will need the approval of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has certainly vacillated on his stance on this entire process. Last month on state TV, he said, quote, "We don't accept the 10-year restriction. Research and development must continue." Then he also recently tweeted, "We are serious in efforts for lifting sanctions, yet see them as an opportunity. Sanctions made us reconsider and rely on our domestic power." Kayvon, where does the Ayatollah really stand? How do we read into these messages?
Sure. So his strategy from the outset of this recent round of negotiations has basically been to say that he's giving his negotiators the space to negotiate, but saying that he's basically not optimistic about it. So I compare it to the saying, success has 1,000 fathers while failure is an orphan. Because if the whole thing falls apart or, Iran gets a bum deal as a result, he can say, I was pessimistic from the beginning and thereby kind of keep his credibility. But he has, basically endorsed his negotiators engaging with the P5+1 on the issue.
One of the issues here, of course, is also the issue of Israel. And I think that probably one of the most vocal critics of this deal is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who has warned that a deal would, quote, "pave the way to Iran owning a nuclear bomb." Earlier this year, this is what President Obama said to try to allay those fears.
It's no secret that the Israeli Prime Minister and I don't agree about whether the United States should move forward with a peaceful resolution to the Iranian issue. If, in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu is looking for the most effective way to ensure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon, this is the best option.
Lacey, what do you say to that? Is reaching a deal more important than the U.S.-Israeli relationship? How strained do you think that relationship is or will be if this deal really goes through?
So there's no question that the U.S. and Israel have disagreed on certain points of this negotiation. They've disagreed very openly. This is not the first time that the U.S. and Israel have disagreed on something. So this is not new. This is not something that is going to be detrimental to the relationship in the future. This is something that ultimately they're going to disagree on this. They're going to move forward with a very strong relationship, as they always have. And Israel is going to be much safer because of this agreement. This agreement is going to stop Iran from having a nuclear weapon for 10 years and more, given that certain parts of the deal will remain in place indefinitely. Things like the additional protocol that will keep inspectors on the ground and be very, very important to maintaining Iran's status as a non-nuclear weapon state. So this is ultimately very good for the U.S. It's very good for Israel, and it will be good for the relationship going forward.
Can I just add to that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu has definitely staked out a kind of maximalist position on this issue. But many senior Israeli intelligence officials have said, at least privately, that if a deal is done, Israel may complain about it, but will ultimately support it and uphold this agreement. But on this topic of U.S.-Israeli-Iranian triangular relationship, what we have to get to is really the core issue of the mistrust and, as Robert alluded to earlier, all of the really awful rhetoric that is taking place. So I support this nuclear deal, but ultimately there are broader issues within this kind of triangular relationship that we need to start to address.
I want to talk about what happens once this deal, which it seems like things are heading that direction, if it's reached, then what happens here in the United States? Because, of course, Congress has to review the deal. And so if it's done by this Thursday, then Congress has 30 days. If it misses the deadline of this Thursday, then Congress is going to have 60 days to do it. Robert, what do you think that the environment is like right now in Washington, D.C., and the attitude towards these negotiations?
Pessimistic at best. This morning, there was an excellent opinion editorial in the Politico magazine by one Dennis Ross, who happens to be a 5- or 6-time U.S. ambassador to various Middle Eastern countries, depending on how you count the 5th or 6th country, in which he expresses valid concerns about the content of the deal, about the efficacy of future agreements that are executive agreements brokered between us and the Islamic Republic of Iran. Again, something that I think everyone present is intellectually honest enough to admit. Reaching an agreement with Rouhani is probably a smart course, if only that was the political reality, which it is not. You have to reach it with Khamenei, and you have to reach it with the IRGC command network, which is multiple commanders. We have nothing like that in the United States, so I don't expect Americans to relate to that. The French don't have anything like that, and the Brits don't have anything like that. No one else has something like this except Iran, and it's a permanent deep state of intelligence and military officials who do weigh in on matters of importance because they feel that they need to when it is politically viable. And they also get a vote. From what I see in Washington, it appears to be 50-50. People are ambivalent yet hopeful about the deal on one side, and then on the other side, it's heavily pessimistic only because they believe that Iran is not operating in good faith. I do happen to lean towards the latter because I have experience dealing with Iran, all of it negative. I don't think that they're coming to the table with good intentions. That said, the people of Iran probably do not agree with the theocratic regime's position, and IRGC is always operating in bad faith and never negotiates in good faith. So whether or not we get Rouhani to the table and Zarif and these other people decide to hammer out a deal with us is less than relevant, because it has to stick with the permanent establishment. And I would caution again that the Western world has nothing like that. So it is difficult for Americans specifically to relate to that. We don't have a permanent deep state that weighs in on matters of political importance. We don't have that here.
At least not openly, you could say. Akbar, what do you make?
No, we just don't have one.
What do you make of Robert's point there? And, also conversely, some people have compared perhaps not the IRGC, but the other hardliners and the Ayatollah in Iran to Republicans in Congress, and have said that really the partisan nature of the opposition to the deal can in many ways be also looked at as, as something that does not really happen in good faith and is not really about the interests of the United States.
Well, just to that last point, I would say that's interesting because there are an array of partisan interests who are against the deal. There's been excellent reporting on the people who have been funding anti-deal rhetoric, op-eds, studies that have been done. Just yesterday, Eli Clifton wrote a very good piece for Low Blog investigating how Sheldon Adelson's foundation was one of the main backers of a group called the Nuclear Iran. So it's important to remember, Alana, as you're pointing out, that there are partisan interests here. They may be pro-Israel, they may be skeptical of Iran for other reasons, but they're funding this, and there are different aspects of the American political scene just as much. I'd also say Lacey made a really important point at the beginning that seems to be getting a bit forgotten, which is that this is a nuclear negotiation. I think members of Congress have really realized that. While there continues to be pessimism, Senator Bob Corker, who's the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and who paved the way for this to even happen between Senate Republicans and the administration, he's been more pessimistic in recent weeks than he has been previously. That they aren't outright coming out and saying they don't want this deal to happen. They're saying we want to look at it. Senators who are skeptical of the deal, Lana, are now looking at other avenues to punish Iran for behavior they see as suspect. Because as has been mentioned, Iran is, of course, a state sponsor of terror. It is supporting the Bashar Assad regime in Syria. It is involved in malicious activity around the region and human rights abuses. So senators have brought up issues like Iran's funding of Hezbollah in Lebanon. They've brought up Iran's intercontinental ballistic missile capabilities. And those issues are going to be brought up whether or not Congress approves the deal. It's important to remember, though, that in this 60 days or 30 days, Congress is looking at a nuclear agreement. Whatever happens beyond that to punish Iran for other behavior is not related, at least in a congressional view and the Obama administration's view, to a deal on the weapon.
Lacey, how do you see this playing out in Washington?
Yeah, that's absolutely, I agree with that point. It's very important to remember that Iran's relationship with the U.S., Iran's international relationships on the international stage, they may shift. We may see an opening. We may have a very optimistic view after this deal of how that might change. Iran's relationship with the U.S. Congress is not going to change overnight. This is going to remain a tense relationship that will continue, particularly with regard to terrorism sanctions and human rights sanctions that will remain in place and will continue to be exactly as they are enforced, exactly as they are now. What will change is that there will be inspectors on the ground. With more access than they have now. We will have restrictions on Iran's nuclear program. We'll be able to do environmental testing on Iran's nuclear activities. We'll have much more access than we do now. We'll have the continued access that we've had through the course of the interim agreement. And all of that ensures that because we don't trust Iran, which is a very important point here, because we do not trust Iran and we do not trust their activities overseas, we want to have as much access as we possibly can to their nuclear program to ensure that they don't build a nuclear weapon. And that's what this deal is all about.
And of course, in Iran's interest here is the lifting of economic sanctions. Kayvon, how would this change life for average Iranians on a daily basis if these sanctions are lifted?
Yeah, I think it would improve the economy, but there are deeper fundamental problems with the Iranian economy that don't necessarily have to do with sanctions, too. There was tremendous mismanagement, especially under the Ahmadinejad presidency, that has led to really high levels of unemployment, especially youth unemployment, and they do have a youth bulge under 35, and very high rates of inflation as well. So I think you may start to see some improvements in the Iranian economy, but it is probably going to remain a pretty sluggish economy despite sanctions being removed.
And, at this point, if you look at what is at stake for Iran, as you mentioned, there are other factors that complicate the health of the economy locally. Is this enough, though, right? Is the prospect of lifting the sanctions enough for Iran to really make concessions and try to come up with a good deal? We keep having this conversation about a good deal versus a bad deal versus no deal. And on the part of the United States, I think there are a lot of people that are kind of beating the war drum, saying that, if not this, the other option would be some type of military confrontation. What are the choices now that have to be made? Where does each side stand in terms of what's to be won or what's to be lost?
Right. Well, I think it's still quite unlikely that we're going to go to war. I mean, there is some posturing going on here, but I think the only real window where the U.S. and Iran had some chance of going to war was in the immediate aftermath of the Iraq war, right after the invasion, where I think Iran really perceived that there was a chance of a U.S. intervention. Since then, and since all the problems in Iraq, I think it's very unlikely that that's going to happen, which is a good thing. But in terms of what, like Iran being incentivized to offer its concessions, see, I
think we just lost Kayvon there right as he was about to make his point, but hopefully we'll get him back in a minute. Robert, I go to you. What, in your mind, would be a good deal here?
now limited enrichment. And once the U.S. made that fundamental shift, it became possible for Iran and the U.S. to find areas of agreement. And if you
Kayvon, let me just cut you off. Sorry, because we lost your audio for a minute there. And so can I ask you to start again?
Finish this point. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
okay
no,
now?
I'd just like for you to start again because we missed a lot of what you were saying. We lost your
Sure,
audio.
I'll very briefly summarize. All I was trying to say was that the way I see it is that the reason that this latest round of negotiations is proving successful is because the U.S. moved from a position of zero enrichment to limited enrichment. And once they made that shift, the two sides, or really the P5+1 and Iran, were able to find areas of common ground. And the proof is there. I mean, if you just look at the agreements that Iran was offering with the EU when they were negotiating from 2005 to 2003 to about 2006, they mirror very closely the interim agreement that they reached in April. So Iran was offering to make these types of concessions a long time ago, but the U.S. at that point had, I think, a maximalist position of zero enrichment. So that's how I see it. I think it's because the U.S. has now shifted to limited enrichment that Iran is that they're so much closer to reaching this deal. And I think Iran wants this deal because they want the sanctions removal, but they also, I think, want to reduce the amount, their threat perception of the United States, because this is a regime that does fear the United States, that believes the United States wants to overthrow the regime and wants to remove, what they prize as their Islamic revolution. And so I think they want that threat to be diminished somewhat.
All right, I have to leave it there. But clearly this is an issue that is not yet resolved, and we will continue to discuss it here at HuffPost Live. But in the meantime, Kayvon, Lacey, Robert, and Akbar, thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Loda Minkovsky. You're watching HuffPost Live, and stay with us. Caroline is up next.